Orange pill. Orange pill. Orange pill.
Love Supreme. Yeah, Love Supreme. You know, I had to go to that John Coltrane place in my mind, which I often do in these times. You know, they got a church of John Coltrane somewhere down there.
What do you think John Coltrane would think of Orange San Francisco?
Well, he clearly would say that this is the rise of the orange pill nation, orange pill reality. It's like a giant orange pill just enveloping the city there. You know, this is where the orange pill needs to infiltrate first, I would say. Silicon Valley, San Francisco needs to convert completely to orange pill nation. And then from there we go east, take over the entire United States. And I think it's a testament to the power of this podcast. Just a few short episodes into it, and the entire orangification of San Francisco in real time, people now understand the power of what we're saying here.
Orange pill, right. And, you know, I think we made it happen. I also think the ridiculousness of actions being taken by the elite as the elite grasp on the elite messaging system and reality, their control of reality is slipping away. And I think you see that in some of our headlines today, because what you're seeing is like the beginning of atomization of humans happened over the past few decades of this era of fiat, these dark ages of fiat. But people are starting to come together again and creating their own realities. And I think some of these headlines, Max, you might see that in there. First, we're going to talk about this one. Hilarious. Some of the U.S. helicopter currency actually made it all the way to Austria. So, of course, the Austrian School of Economics gets a whole bunch of free money coming from the United States. And one of the stimulus packages, apparently like 1,000 checks showed up in Austria for some reason.
Yeah, the American empire has no boundaries. The fiat money apocalypse is unlimited. And why not send thousands of checks to Austria? Send them to every corner of the earth. It's a last gasp of the money printers and the fiat money disciples who don't understand. As you point out about Adam, we've gone from Adam and Eve to atomization and something that rhymes with Eve.
But you know what I want to say, you know, the next story, because we talk about atomization and destabilization of the global economy. And one of the beginning really of the end started in 2000 when we saw the Commodity Futures Modernization Act brought in and derivatives were brought in, which was a simulation of the real economy and the real wealth and real goods and services. And you could start you could start fictionalizing them and packaging that fiction up and selling it. And then exotic derivatives started to be built by a whole bunch of French engineers in particular. Many of them were trained by our neighbor in Paris. And this reminds me of what went wrong in 2008. French man blows up part of his house while chasing a fly. And this guy, what he did is, we've seen this, we've experienced this firsthand, is he didn't want to pay, apparently in France, like you can get your gas, your home natural gas supply at home without any scent in it at all. The scent, you know, there's no smell to natural gas naturally. They add the scent in order for you to smell it, and you should know that you might be killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. Well, a lot of French people choose not to put the scent in there to save a few bucks every month. Our former landlord did this, and he almost killed us. But the thing is, this guy didn't know that there was gas in his house, and he had an electric fly swatter and blew up his house.
Right, it is a French phenomenon that you can get the cheaper gas with no scent added. that it put in there so that, and we did have a landlord. We had a, when we were visiting him in the south of France, he said, by the way, the gas here is unscented. So there is a risk that we could blow up. So this was like very interesting. And French people are like this in a lot of ways. They always say that in France, they talk about sex and think about money. And in America, they talk about money and think about sex. And that's kind of the difference between the two cultures in one aphorism or maxim. But I was going to say this whole idea of chasing the fly and then blowing up your house. I mean, this is essentially the central banks chasing that elusive 2% inflation number and blowing up the world economy. Because that 2% inflation number will never come as they define it, because they're trying to solve a debt money problem by issuing more debt money. And then add on top of that, as our friend who we had on the show recently talked about the ever exponential decrease in cost for technology, the deflationary collapse, Jeff Booth. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book, and it's making great waves around the crypto Bitcoin community. And so that inflation target will never, ever be met. And like the fly in France, like le fly, how do you say fly in French again? Le peste? No, I think that is something.
You would know better than I.
Yeah, forget the fly. We say fly. But this is never going to happen. But the house of the economy will blow up. It is being destroyed. Remember, don't blame it on COVID. Don't blame it on politics. Don't blame it on Rio. Blame it on this central bank fake chase of the 2% inflation target. That's why the global economy has and is and will continue to collapse.
Yeah, and I might extend that analogy to the point that, like, okay, you're chasing this fly in a flammable home, in a toxic home filled with natural gas, and you're using an electric fly swatter. The fly is like the business cycle. And the government, the central banks don't want the business cycle, but another business cycle is going to come along. It doesn't matter how many flies you swat. There's always going to be another fly around. And the same thing with the business cycle. There's always going to be another business cycle, but the central banks keep on thinking like if they're going to create some elaborate fly swatter to destroy the business cycle, that somehow miraculously they're going to have some sort of miraculous economy.
Puce is the name of flea in French. So remember, marché puce is the big, huge flea market in Pont-Clignancourt in the north, which I think was sold a few years ago. But that's a fantastic place to hang out if you're visiting Paris. Of course, you won't be because of the COVID lockdown. But if you were, you would go to the Marché Puce, the flea market in the north of Paris, because it's you can spend a whole day there very easily, and it's just fascinating place to go. But don't even think about it, because of course you can't travel, and that is probably closed anyway by now. And they've turned it into an enormous parking lot. Here's
another story, and because we're talking in this episode, the next few headlines, about these atomized humans, previously atomized humans, coming together in groups, small groups, whether on Telegram or Reddit or Twitter or Facebook, and they're starting to create their own realities, because the reality that has been the organizing principle of our own economies around the world, and Adam Curtis, his stuff really goes over this about these fake HyperNormalization, he calls it, where our societies, like even the elite, stop believing it. They don't believe in it. And we're at that sort of moment where we have this reality that the elite don't even believe in anymore, but they're pointing at fake news, and that's fake news, and this is fake news, because nobody believes the reality they've created. So they're starting to form their own realities. And we're going to go into that. But here you could see that even some like old realities, here, like, okay, we've known the earth is round since Aristotle. So like almost 2,500 years ago, right? So we've known the earth is round, but here there are still these flat earthers, and it's kind of like a growing community. Flat earthers end up in quarantine after sailing to the end of the world. An Italian couple got lost while trying to make it to the Italian island of Lampedusa, where they believe the world ends. So the world, obviously, you and I have flown over there on our way to North Africa and the Middle East. And of course, it keeps on going past Lampedusa. But here are these people, like, they believe it's still a flat earth, and they're unwilling to see otherwise. And this is a sort of phenomenon you see in a world of like the disintegration of the reality all around us. The sandcastles are melting.
Right. Well, the human mind works on electricity, and a lot of people get zapped. The microwave blows up, or they're in France, they try to kill a fly, and they use atomic weapons, and part of the brain can be deleted or erased. And these people have erased all that part of the brain that would be the last 300 years of accumulated wisdom, and they're back into medieval days, and they're trying to sail off the end of the earth. And that's part of, I think you're right, the new atomization, the new trend toward creating and seeking out new ways to live in groups, in communities. We've been through several. From the hunter-gatherer days, we transitioned to the agricultural days around 10, 12,000 years ago. This gave rise to monarchs and the aristocracy. This gave rise to the nation state. And I think we're entering a post-nation state reality, this new renaissance, as you like to say. And so there's a lot of experimentation of how to create communities and groups, and how do we live together, the families, extended families, and how do we go forward. And so there's much experimentation. In the case of Bitcoin, of course, this is amazing because it separates state from money for the first time in history. Even gold has a lot of difficulty getting out of the way of state domination. So this is truly the first time that has ever happened. And so people are thinking, you know what, if I don't need the state to guarantee my money, well, what do I need the state for at all? And the answer is you don't. So why not just start a tribe? Why not just start a community? Why not just go off grid or on grid, but go off the nation state? And that's the conclusion that's becoming, the light bulb is going on in all around the world.
Well, in order to de-atomize, I think we were atomized during the neoliberal era, at the dark ages of the fiat era since 1971. And we were atomized into individuals and torn apart from groups and society and communities and family in order to sell more, in order to create more opportunity for services, for example, that the family used to provide. So now we're de-atomizing. We're becoming we're coagulating around groups. And the important thing for that always is stories. So your stories and your myths, your origin myths, your creation myths, who you are as a people. So we're going to look at these stories, and some might call it reality, how you organize the reality around you and look at it. Now, first of all, the disintegration of the fiat empire that is run by America. You could see it in the fact that Hollywood is the number one myth maker of this empire. And just like the cable news in Washington, D.C. and New York City is losing control over the narrative, so is Hollywood. And it's they themselves who have lost it. Just like the emperors of Rome, just like the Soviet Union, they ran out of ideas, right? And all they had were these Potemkin societies. Hollywood's vanishing creativity, proportion of original films in the worldwide top 50 grossing films, 1978 to 2019. And as you can see, it's barely it's like not even half of them are original anymore. So the boomers who've kind of controlled, this entire reality of the fiat empire, these dark ages, they ran out of ideas. And it only makes sense that the out of the ashes, you're going to see the new generations have to rebuild. There's a rebirth.
Right. Yeah. Looking at the history of Hollywood is always interesting because it does mirror to a large degree the history of modern America, certainly 20th century America. And you had some periods in Hollywood. You had the golden era, the studios, kind of the birth of Hollywood. And then you had the era of the 70s where there was independent filmmakers like Martin Scorsese. Steven Spielberg was kind of an independent filmmaker who showed up, a young guy at that time, or the young guns came in. And also, let's say a film like The French Connection by the director, I'll think of his name in a second, was remarkable kind of change of pace. Then we had the Reagan years and the beginning of a very, very corporatized Hollywood. And the problem with corporatized Hollywood is that it's very debt driven. And so to pay off the interest on that debt, they have to not take chances. And taking chances with stories is something they're not willing to do because the board of directors will say, look, we got to pay off this debt, and we're just going to do the same film we did every year for the past 10 years and just get it out there and get the clicks going. And so it's the death of the storytelling center, which is, I think, what you're saying there is that the American culture, to a large degree, was informed by the storytellers in Hollywood through this medium of film. And so that the economics of it are such now where it's breaking apart. So not only is that industry dying in a lot of ways, again, but the Americans' identity and the ability to identify who they are is also dying. And as our friend Chris Fenton talks about, who is a former Hollywood agent, so much of the Hollywood output now is conforming to the demands of the foreign markets in which they have to play into, like China and other areas too. So that has an effect.
Well, yes, it's twofold. It is what you're saying, the profit motive, and it's no investor. You want to take as least amount of risk as possible, and it's the least amount of risk is the story that worked last year. Let's tell it again, and just like it with different actors in it, and it works. So let's keep with that, and obviously that's going to be part of it. But just like, it made sense for the owners of enterprises and manufacturing outfits and industry to send all the jobs over to China. Made sense at the time because it was a hugely profitable. It made them wealthy. It made shareholders wealthy. But at the end of the day, it destroyed the entire U.S. economy, and it's dead now because of that, because we don't have the factory floor on which to innovate. And that's where all innovation in production and assembly happens. Now, in terms of what they've done because of the incentive for profit in terms of putting out the same story every year, is that's part of the myth of what makes the United States, which is just a giant meme about freedom, about democracy, about, America, fuck yeah, we're the good guys, right? So if you run out of things to say, and this is what we are in a globalized world, you have to have a story. What's your story? And if you run out of stories to explain the world around us, well, that's the disintegration of your essence. Like, if you can't tell your story, as it apparently we can't, like, that's not any other foreign nation. That's you. You can't tell your story. You've run out of ideas.
Right. The storytelling is a unit of society that goes back thousands of years, and before that, even during the pre-hunter, the ability to sit around the campfire and tell stories has been a central part of the human experience since the beginning, and it's how people organize their societies and organize their groups. And the stories are always metaphors, like this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, or this is the chief, and this is the guy who here's the hero, this heroic character saved the village. And so you're communicating the values of the village, and you're telling it in a story, and creation myths and all this. William Friedkin, by the way, is the director of the French Connection. And then, an underrated film of his that you should check out is To Live and Die in L.A.
Oh, I love that.
By William Friedkin, and is really a cool film with a great soundtrack by Wang Chung Tonight. It's an awesome soundtrack. So the stories that glue the narrative together, certainly during World War II or during a great example is World War II. The story, the propaganda back home was the values of America as told through the Hollywood machine. So you had Bob Hope and the USO shows, and you had movies extolling the values. And then, getting back to the Vietnam War, suddenly that storytelling in Hollywood, because Hollywood, the golden era had crashed. So these young guns in Hollywood were telling stories with the anti-hero, with Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, and these not classical Cary Grant looking Hollywood figures became dominant in the storytelling, and it was French Connection, or it was The Godfather, and it was stories that told the dark side of America. So that reinforced the negativity, if you will, of the tragedy of the Vietnam War. And so was it cathartic? I tell you, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a film with Jack Nicholson. Milos Forman, I think, is the director. I watched it again recently, and I was shocked at how gruesome that story really is, and how brutal that story is. That if people like millennials and Gen Z, they would watch that film and they would be shocked at how brutal this story by Ken Casey is the source material, and it's really about a guy who tries to go against the system and is electroshocked in the institution, and then is mercifully killed, right? And it's extremely brutal. And the character of Nurse Ratched is there, and she's a frightening character. And these films you never see these stories now because of the whole Disneyfication of the culture. It's all about bunny rabbits and hugging, and everyone's your best friend, and everyone gets a gold star, and so you've got this really well, I don't know how to call it, narcalized population.
Well, again, we're going to go into this thread here where you create your own reality. And it's when that your stories become so disconnected from the actual reality of the things that are happening on the ground. We see that in the stock markets, okay? That's a story that wealthy people are telling themselves, and what the central bank tells the wealthy people. They tell you that everything is okay, and the stock market's at our all-time highs. GDP itself doesn't go up. So this is a disconnect. When those disconnects become so vast and then there's no explanation, they themselves, the generals in charge, have no idea, and they refuse to believe anything else. And Max and I have been watching a few documentaries about World War II, about the Vietnam War. And one thing that you see, which is like just so amazing that I can't understand how this happens, is like when Pearl Harbor happened, a few hours beforehand, two guys, like 19 years old, on lookout at another end of a Hawaiian island, called over and said, hey, there's some bombers, Japanese bombers flying in. And the general said, no, that can't be true. Yeah. It's like, wait, I saw it with my own eyes, I'm telling you. And that happened.
Doesn't fit the model.
It doesn't fit the model. So like they just say it didn't happen. And so we're just going to live in this reality where we're not about to be bombed by Japanese. Same thing happened to Hitler. To the French in 1940, when again, guys in planes called down to the generals and said, there's a huge column of German troops coming in through the Ardennes. And they were like, no, that's not going to happen. That's not true. And they're like, no, we see giant columns of tanks and vehicles. And they're like, no.
Doesn't fit the model.
And like, how does that happen? And this is the same thing, like we're coming up with analogies for what the central bank's doing. Like this is them, like looking at the economy and the stories, the reality they're creating with their stories, their fiction, that is the stock market, that is the money supply, that is the free money. Like they're creating this elaborate fiction that they refuse to stop. Like no amount of data, no amount of facts, no amount of reality can intervene with their story.
The map is not the territory, right? So they will look at the data and their conclusions will be based on their model of how that data is presented, even though it contradicts. If they opened the window and looked out and saw the reality, they would say, I believe my data, not my own eyes, not reality. But that's a common fallacy, an institutional fallacy. Anytime institutions become too dominant, they tend to ignore the information coming from the actual sources, and they only rely on the filter, the way that information is filtered to create their model, because that is the status quo and that supports their lifestyle. And, these generals are living high on the hog.
So, this is important to this thread I'm going to read because it's based on this book called History Has Begun. So, we had the end of history, but now history has begun. It's like a rebirth at the beginning of us telling our story. And we know people want a new story because we saw what happened in 2016. Despite all the odds, the orange clown won. And why did he win? Because he said, make America great again. That was the story he sold to people. Hillary said, I'm with her. It's about me. Vote for me. I deserve it. This is my turn. And then when it was obvious that people instead wanted to hear the story, make America great again, she was like, America's already great. What are you saying? And that, I think, really made her lose, because people were like, hello, maybe in your reality that you've created for yourself, and certainly there is a reality that is different in Manhattan and the Hamptons and out in, the Westchester County where she lives. But here's a thread about this. Reality is up for grabs right now. We're seeing more and more groups bootstrapping their own reality. People call this community building, but sometimes it's literally people defecting the shared sense of mainstream reality that has existed for centuries and creating new ones. Faith and institutions are crumbling at the same time the platforms for people to exit their own realities and enter new ones are growing. So, this is the failure we've been talking about over the past 5 to 10 years. Really, the failure, the disconnect between these two communities was inevitable because of the wealth and income gap and the bubble that can exist in Manhattan and DC. And you're around the emperor, you're around very powerful people, and you believe that you're all good, and you can't believe that you would do anything bad or cause any harm. And the disconnect has snapped.
Right. And the enabling element this time is Bitcoin because it's not tied to the sovereign. It separates state from money. And the problem every single time people try to defect from the overlord is that overlord controls the money. If it's gold, they control the gold. If it's fiat money, they control the fiat money. This is now the first time in history, this natural inclination toward freedom, it can be matched with perfect money, a stateless, no flag money. So that's the first time ever. So now this is, you call it a renaissance. I think that's true. And this will be an interesting period because you're taking the human consciousness, which is very inventive, and it's proven itself to be successful in many ways, unsuccessful in other ways, but still you have to say humans are somewhat successful as a species. And you marry that with perfect money, store of value, unit of exchange, and incredible things are happening. Right now in Nigeria, for example, 30% of the population is already into hyper-Bitcoinization. They already have gotten rid of the dollar, gotten rid of the state money, gotten rid of all forms of money except for Bitcoin. And now you're seeing a renaissance in Nigeria. You're seeing that happen in other countries. I think to your point is that on the atomization of this is that there's nothing that stops a group of 10 or 15 or 20 people from saying, okay, we're going to secede. We're stepping out and we're just going to create our own reality. This is our money. And we don't recognize the state.
So this is where it connects to the Renaissance 1.0. I believe we're in 2.0 is that the collapse of institutions that happened, with the Black Plague in Italy, especially because Rome, the Vatican was in Rome and the Vatican controlled the world. They were the organizing principle. They were the storyteller for the European population. And so they had just gone through the dark ages, essentially, of the Vatican-controlled universe, the known universe of Europe. And when the Black Plague hit and they had no explanation, they had no way to describe what was happening, they had no answer for the population. And this person points out, in the most uncertain of some people's lives, COVID, people are scrambling for leaders who can give them a sense of what reality is or should be. So we're seeing that same sort of thing is the elite keep getting caught with no answers, partly because they just don't care about you. They just don't care about the ordinary person. And it's very hard for them to empathize with any of these deplorables, as Hillary called them. Like, why should I spend any of my time or energy worrying about what somebody in, Idaho, let them go overdose on opioids. I don't care. I don't have an answer for them. I don't want to interrupt my lifestyle.
Right, and that period you described, Middle Ages and the plague and the loss of centralized authority by the Vatican was matched by what was happening in Florence in Italy at the time. Yes. And Leonardo da Vinci and the Medici family and Medici Bank were able to engineer a renaissance, a rebirth, by essentially not only reaching back to the Greek aesthetics and the Greek times, but to recognize that within human were an already divine quality that did not need to be sanctified by any outside force or verified by any outside force. They were, through art, speaking directly to God, bypassing the church. You don't need the church. You don't need the Catholic Church to have have communication with God, you can have that certainly. In one manifestation would be through art. So artists are communicating with God, and we look at that and we say, I recognize that because I too have a divine quality, and that's why I recognize what you're doing as art. So that was the beginning of this Renaissance. Now, flash forward to 2020, and institution authority has collapsed. The money supply is collapsing. Nobody has trust in anything that institutional is happening, but they're still human. They can still have a conversation with God.
I mean, it's obviously the stories that the elite are telling us and continue to tell us and try to tell us, and they forgot the story. They forgot where it began. They've lost control of their story. So it makes sense to try to figure out, okay, where did this story go wrong? How do we get this all back on track? And how do we understand all of the world around us? Because that's the human experience, is trying to understand the world around us. We're going to talk to a physicist in a few moments who, obviously physicists look around the world and try to figure out, what is all this stuff? What is it? Is this matter? Is this energy? Is this time, space? What? And finally, he says, if you have a creative vision of what the world is or should be, and you have the will to create cultural artifacts that embody that vision of reality, and you just have the discipline and skill really to push it through, then you are essentially the founder of a new reality. This prediction of the theory seems borne out by what is now called the creator economy. What we call content creators are really seed stage reality entrepreneurs, and what we call their fans are consumers of or investors in the entrepreneur's model of reality.
Look, creativity can get ugly, and look at what we call freaks and mutants. This is the seedbed for shifts in reality, and so is tragedy. And these things should not be rejected and avoided. They should be understood and embraced. This is how you move from point A to point B. Is our friend Nozomi was talking about the holy shit coin. She's saying essentially everything comes from shit. Everything comes from blackness. And
manure, fertilizer.
Right. And so this is there's nothing tragic, and there's nothing particularly heroic. There's only the present. And that present is shaped in ways that nobody understands or can predict. And certainly, you can make educated guesses. I mean, it was not hard to predict that with the American economy as over-leveraged as it is, if something like COVID hit, it would destroy the economy because it's not equipped to handle any kind of change that would require. There was no strategic reserve. There was no seed corn. There was no warehouses full of provisions. I mean, the America was a just-in-time economy, over-leveraged, and if you threw a monkey wrench into that, it was going to collapse, and that's what happened. I mean, you could have made that educated guess, and you would have been correct. Okay, now here we are. We had the once in a 1,000-year event that was pretty predictable, and so where we go from here, it's going to have to be purely spiritual. There's not going to be a dogmatic set of rules that's going to take the experience of humans forward. It's going to be everyone kind of shutting the fuck up and just listening to their greater spiritual selves. Maybe through meditation is a good way to do it. Then you find a path forward.
Well, we couldn't bring you Sats, Margs, and Orange Pill without our sponsor, the Sun Exchange, and they really fit into our sort of lifestyle and themes and ideologies and how we view the world. And I'm going to throw to an ad from them, and then we'll come back, and then we'll go to a great interview.
Sun Exchange is the world's first peer-to-peer solar leasing platform. Earn Bitcoin solar power in communities in Africa and be part of the new world economy. Visit thesunexchange.com/orange pill and start monetizing sunshine today.
thesunexchange.com/orange pill is the location to go. And I am going to organize a group Zoom call. And there were a few people who were ready to sign up for that. And I think we'll do that in the next week or two. And I'd like to, because there is a new project coming up. And again, this one fits in with the theme. The principal of this school in South Africa, Norman Henshelwood High School, they're looking for a 53.6 kilowatt project that we're going to build through the Sun Exchange. He said, You can do anything you put your mind to. It is never too late or too early to start creating the life that you want. That was his message to the new class, the class of 2020.
That's a good message.
That's exactly what we're saying here, that you can create the life you want to. Like, you can reject this, elite failed message that is, as we have talked about, as Matt Taibbi had talked about. We could all see that their story has failed. Their storyline has failed as the money printer go brr, right? That's their storyline. That's like their Hail Mary of a storyline. Is like, there's a certain point in some movies that you just walk out of the theater. You're like, okay, there's no more suspension of disbelief. Like, you don't believe this storyline, and it's a stupid storyline, and you don't, like when Jar Jar Banks came on to to Star Wars, you're like, nope, can't believe this, and you walk out, right? Well, money printer go.
You jumped the shark, right? Even Fonzie jumped the shark in Happy Days.
Yes,
it was over.
Yes, so we've jumped the shark. Jay Powell is like Jar Jar Banks. We're just like
he's
laughing.
The Fonzie of central bankers.
Yeah. So we don't believe that. And that is really important to having faith in these institutions. In God we trust is like what they say on the US currency, because it's not real money anymore. So you're supposed to just have faith, and nobody has faith in the currency, and therefore that's one of our basic communication ways of communicating with each other around the world has always been our money.
Right, and they're misusing the phrase God there on the money, because it's I don't want to get into that, digress down that rabbit hole at this moment. But
I have a way to describe it.
Yeah.
I could say, it's like how Einstein meant when he said God doesn't play dice with the universe, is like they're playing dice with the economy. They're playing dice with the population and gaslighting them with this fake economy that they keep on trying to say, no, look at the stock market. That's real. Forget your reality that you see every day on the street in the middle of nowhere, America. This is real.
It's false advertising, right? I mean, Bitcoin, you could build a case for it being God. Okay, I understand that. But the fiat money dollar, that's false advertising. That's a false idol. That's nothing to do with God. That's the opposite of God. That's the frickin' devil.
Well, certainly Bitcoin is its own unit of trust. So this is what they're saying with the history has begun, is that we're finding we need faith, we need trust, it seems to be just as important as greed, for example, in the human experience. So you need trust, you need to have some sort of safety, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And we're building that in this community. It might not be right for other people, but this community is what we see is our reality, which is the orange pill reality.
I think again about the interview we did with Nozomi.
She's the best.
She really lays it out. I mean, that was episode 4, I believe. This is episode 5, and she's the guest on episode 4. And I think you could watch that once a month and get something out of it every single time you watch that interview with her. I really think she's the deepest metaphysical mind in the Bitcoin space.
That was episode 3, Nozomi Haye's last episode was Knut Svanholm. And before we go to our interview with our next guest for this episode 5, I want to show you, speaking of Renaissance, The Rebirth of Venice by Satoshi Nakamoto, 2009, The Dawn of the Bitcoin Renaissance. This is from RDBTC. This was a few weeks ago, but I've been meaning to try to show that to you, but we always run out of time because there's always so much mind-blowing stuff. And speaking of mind-blowing stuff, we have this guy that we're going to throw in I'm going to spin into like some sort of segue, a transition from here to the interview, which we did before we recorded this. So, the space-time continuum in this episode is actually like quantum. It's like, if Einstein were to look at this episode, he would say, God doesn't play dice with the orange pill.
Indubitably.
So here's our interview with Bob McElrath. All right, Max. Well, speaking of the nature of reality and all of this stuff, there's a guy that we have to interview now who messed with my own concept of reality for years. I had believed in these alternative Stacys living in parallel universes on these strings, like in universes. Anyway, this guy is a physicist, and he laughed at me and said that is basically fake news in the physicist world. Bob McElrath, welcome to Orange Pill.
Thank you. Hello.
So you're confirming that. You're doubly confirming that, right? There's no strings of Stacys out there.
Well, if there were, we couldn't tell. And if you can't tell, does it matter? Does it exist? Right? So I can neither confirm nor deny, but I also can't confirm whether, we're actually made up of little tiny dragons living on little tiny unicorn popsicles,
I get it. Okay. Now why we wanted to bring you on here is because of the fact that you're a physicist, and we are trying to uncover the nature of our new reality that we live in, here on Orange Pill. But you also, obviously, as a physicist, would understand energy. And we have been talking about this. I'm going to start first with a tweet you sent, which is that there is exactly one asset in the universe: energy. It's the common denominator of all other assets. Trust me, I'm a physicist. So go into that. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, from a physics perspective, we have a periodic table of elements. We have the standard model of particle physics with, electrons, photons, quarks, all this kind of stuff. And you could look down this list of things and say, well, which one of these is an asset, right? If I have some particular conglomeration of electrons and quarks, you might call that gold. If I have a different conglomeration of quarks and electrons, I might call it platinum or lead or oxygen. Is any one of them an asset? Well, yes. I mean, they're all commodities of a sort. We use them for various things. They all have value. But underlying all of that is something that all forms of particles interact with and have, and that's energy, right? We have this famous equation from Einstein, E equals mc squared, right? So in principle, you can take any form of matter and convert it into energy and vice versa. And in fact, we do this, in the particle accelerators we have at CERN. So I worked at CERN for a couple of years. We smash together protons at very high energy, and out of that comes all forms of matter. And the purpose of that experiment is to figure out what forms of matter exist by smashing things at very high energy, using E equals mc squared, make the E very large and see what comes out on the other side as matter. So we produce photons, gluons, antimatter, all kinds of stuff, everything that exists. And using that, we're able to construct the periodic table, if you will, of particle physics, which is known as the standard model. And in fact, just today, a fellow by the name of Stephen Weinberg at the University of Texas won the Breakthrough Prize for his contribution to the standard model. He's one of the major architects of what we now call the standard model, which has been verified to insane amounts of precision. And we now have essentially a complete, quote unquote, periodic table of all particles. But under that is all energy. Everything's essentially built out of energy one way or another.
Right. And then you segue that into Bitcoin. And so just talk a little bit about that. Right. And so Bitcoin turns energy into a unit of monetary exchange, right?
Yeah, basically. I mean, you would take this energy and you say, well, okay, so if energy is an asset, how do I move it around? How can I use it as a currency? It's very difficult to move energy around. I can make barrels of oil, put them on a tanker, ship them around. There's a whole economy around that. It's quite inefficient to transfer energy. Batteries are quite inefficient. There's a conversion efficiency. There's losses. There's a carrying cost to any form of commodity, and especially energy commodities. So what Bitcoin does is more like manufacturing Bitcoin from energy, right? You're creating a new form of some asset which has better transportability properties than the energy from which it came.
Now, in the periodic table, of course, I guess, my rudimentary understanding, I would say, well, gold is, I think it's number 79 on the periodic table. It refers to, I believe, 79 electrons, if I'm not mistaken. And with Bitcoin, you're saying that it is underlying everything on the periodic table, or should it be on the periodic table?
Well, energy is not an element, right? It's not matter. It is underlying because it's a different thing entirely. Energy is, in some sense, part of space-time. And so all of these elements matter, all the periodic table elements live inside space-time, if you will. There is, so space-time has, we have X and Y and Z of space, and then we have another coordinate time, right? In the physics perspective, there are conjugate variables to that, and those conjugate variables are momentum, if I'm moving through space, and energy. The conjugate variable to time is energy. So they're not on the periodic table because they are kind of the, if you will, the substrate in which the entire periodic table lives.
Right. Now, gold is used as money. It's on the periodic table. It represents a certain amount of energy that takes to get to gold. And with Bitcoin is used as a competing unit of monetization. It's not on the periodic table, but it does compete with gold. Can we say that if you compare Bitcoin with gold, and this is a tough comparison in some ways and in other ways not, but that it's a more efficient conversion of energy to a unit of monetization?
I don't know that I would call it more efficient. I would call it more democratic. So if I want access to gold, I have to find a place to obtain it, right? I have to find a mine in a mountain and dig it out. And that costs energy to do so, right? I have to, get trucks and explosives and mine it out. Satoshi famously said a long time ago that the marginal cost of mining gold has always remained very close to the price of gold. So there's always been this tension between the capital costs of creating a gold mine, and there's an energy cost associated with that too, in extracting and refining it and stuff like that. So gold in some ways already was sort of an energy commodity, right? You have to put energy in to get the gold in the first place. But what is left behind that is the distribution of gold itself. Who has access to it, who can get it? Sometimes you'll hear about asteroid mining, for instance. The reason gold is rare on the Earth is that it's very heavy. And the Earth basically, as it was forming, all the heavy stuff fell toward the center. And so the center of the Earth, the core of the Earth, is made out of mostly iron and nickel, with other things in it like gold and heavier elements and uranium. Fun fact, most of the heat produced by the Earth is from uranium and transuranic heavy elements in the Earth. That's why we have a molten core. It's actually radioactivity. But if you have access to asteroids aren't a planet. They didn't have this phenomena where all the heavy stuff fell toward the center and we get this thin crust of carbon and oxygen on the surface of the asteroid. They're very small. They're made mostly of iron, and they have a tremendous amount of gold. So if we can make a mine that was 5,000 kilometers deep, we could have access to an infinite amount of gold. And if somebody was able to mine an asteroid, they could obtain an amount of gold that would totally tank the market for gold.
Of course, gold is created out of huge amounts of energy. Whether there's
supernova.
With a what?
Supernova.
And I did read that some say that it might have been a collision of two neutron stars. Whatever, it takes a lot of energy to create it.
Yeah.
Now, you're in the Bitcoin mining space. So a lot of people, this is one of the number one arguments you hear against it, especially from the mainstream media, is that it requires a huge amount of energy to mine Bitcoin. What is your take on that argument?
It requires exactly as much energy as we think it's worth. And energy is not a scarce resource, right? Again, we have 1,300 watts per square meter falling on our heads all day, every day. Energy is only scarce because it is not uniformly distributed, right? We have people live mostly in cities, and often the energy production is not in cities. If you want to build a huge solar farm, you're not going to put it in Manhattan, right? You're going to put it out somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Okay, well, the consumers of that energy from that solar farm are not going to be at the solar farm. They're going to have to transmit it somewhere else. So now I have losses, and I have an irregular market where in some places energy is cheap, other places it's expensive. So Bitcoin mining essentially provides a means to have essentially a guaranteed buyer for energy that's produced in some weird place for which there aren't any buyers at a particular time. Bitcoin provides a means to do both time arbitrage and geography arbitrage of energy production. When the wind blows and it's the middle of the night and there are no consumers, Bitcoin will buy that energy, no problem, right? But that's not that's not taking away from anybody else's use of energy. It's not a waste of energy. It's energy that wouldn't have been produced or wouldn't have been consumed otherwise.
Right. So our friend Abe Cambridge over at Sun Exchange, he says the following. I want to get your comment. He says, we're moving from an era of limited energy and infinite paper money to an era of infinite energy and limited Bitcoin.
I don't think the infinite energy part is correct. I mean, there's a lot of energy available. It's a lot more than we extract, but definitely not infinite.
Well, to your point about the amount of energy coming from the sun is quite abundant.
It's quite abundant, yes. It's if we took all of the human consumption of energy and put it in solar panels and put it in one place, it would be, less than like Rhode Island or something. It's we consume far less energy than we have available to us.
So I guess speaking to a physicist, infinite means different than an ordinary person. We think of infinite as like
probably
a lot.
Well, I think Buckminster Fuller used to talk about the amount of solar energy coming on planet Earth was 1,000 times greater than we use or could use or whatever use. Right. It's about right. Okay. So Buckminster Fuller, his math works out then. So yes. That's a lot. So it's metaphorically speaking, it's infinite, but not in the absolute sense. But it's in terms of the amount of energy we need as humans, we got plenty of energy. So, and then the point, I guess, to round that off is to say that we live in an era of infinite paper money, right? Because it's not hard to print the paper money. It can be printed infinitely. And we do so in an era of, we're told that energy, the kind of energy we're getting from carbon, from oil and gas and things like that, we're always facing limitations, and the cost keeps going higher and higher because it's getting scarcer and scarcer. So I guess the flippening or what he's mentioning there is that it's kind of reversing, to the extent that if we can harness the energy efficiently with solar and wind, we're tapping into, quote, virtually infinite energy, but we're doing so to mine something that is of absolute scarcity, and that would be Bitcoin. When you hear that word absolute scarcity, and you're a scientist, so you as you've just demonstrated, you would shy away from generalizations. You are speaking in specifics. But when somebody says Bitcoin is absolutely scarce, is that true?
No. The scarcity of Bitcoin is, in fact, a social construct, right? So the reason Bitcoin is scarce is because there's a set of software nodes out there, and those software nodes enforce a set of rules. And those set of rules say you can only print Bitcoin under certain circumstances, right? So the rule is built in there, and it's a social construct to say, all right, everybody change your software to modify those rules. And it is, in principle, it could be done to modify those rules. People have tried. We had the Bitcoin Cash fork a couple of years ago. They could have tried to increase that the printing of Bitcoin, but most people would say that's not Bitcoin anymore. And it's a social construct that people believe in the thesis of that fixed issuance, and that's their investment thesis. And because of that, I think the majority of people who are investors in Bitcoin would not accept changing the rules in that way. It violates their investment thesis. That's not to say it couldn't be done, but it would be social agreement that everybody agreed that this was the right thing to do. I think it's incredibly unlikely.
Right. So let's talk about social construct for a second. And let's also refer back to something you mentioned earlier, efficiency versus democracy or democratic distribution. Because we know in the Bitcoin protocol, it's got a layer in there of game theory. And so now my question is, these types of things, sociology, psychology, those are not hard sciences anymore. That's not mathematics. That's not physics anymore. That's the very soft and gooey social sciences. So you're a physicist. You're a theoretical physicist. How do you navigate through that world? Because that's not where you come from. I mean, that's a naive question on my part because I don't know, but I'm just saying that there's a cross. And my second part of this question is, does in fact this protocol, does it cross over into these other sciences, and does it impact those sciences to a degree by giving them some quantification that they lacked? In other words, does it harden those sciences, Or does the social sciences baked into the protocol soften the hard science on the other side? There's a hybrid going on here. Can you speak on it?
I would kind of say both. I wouldn't call economics a soft science in ways other people might. So there's a very specific thing that's a very specific kind of game theory. And the thing about economics and game theory is that you can certainly put equations on them. However, they often fail. It's been said that any policy which targets any economic metric causes that economic metric to cease to function in the manner that it was supposed to, right? There are always externalities, right? So if I put a equation on something, and the equation we're talking about here is profit maximization. So within Bitcoin, the assumption is that miners are going to maximize their profit denominated in Bitcoin. Now, if that statement is true, and I can formalize that mathematically, it's a maximization over some set. If that statement is true, then the system works, right? However, there's another world. There are other assets. There are other opportunities outside that. And so because of the existence of this outside world, the formula you write down for the maximization of profit isn't universally true in all circumstances, right? There can be circumstances where, large economic crashes or, other kinds of opportunities cause the maximization function to fail. So when you're looking at a computer science thing, there are certain things within computer science which are absolutely hard and fast. The cryptography of digital signatures, for instance, is not subject to game theory, right? And where you can, when you build a protocol, you want to use those pieces, the absolutely hard and fast pieces of cryptography, you want to use those as much as possible everywhere you possibly can. And up until Bitcoin, no one put an economic incentive into a cryptographic protocol, because an economic incentive is always going to be much weaker than a piece of cryptography. If I could, guarantee through cryptography without the economic incentive, that would be awesome, but we can't. So Satoshi did something very interesting by tying it to an economic incentive. On the one hand, yes, it is weaker. On the other hand, it also causes it to be economics. Up to that point, all the cryptography we did was not economics. It was, digital signatures. It was consensus protocols. Those are necessary, but not sufficient for something to be an economic system. So it is the addition of that weaker, if you will, form of maximization over profit that suddenly created an economic system out of something that underlying it is only cryptography.
Right. So to boil that down a little bit, well, when you talk about incentives here, one could give a shorthand explanation of this and call it greed. And that greed seems to be hard-coded into humans. I mean, humans are greedy for life. Humans, the survival instinct kicks in, and humans are quite reliably are going to fight for survival, as all animals are. We seem to be programmed to want to procreate and continue the species. So that incentive of greed and is expressed in something called price. And as that price goes up, it seems to draw more greed, which in fact draws the network to hash more coins, which adds to the security, which adds to its hardness, which adds to its appeal as hard money. So this virtuous cycle going on. But my question, kind of since we're wandering more into the metaphysical, is that does Bitcoin and the existence of Bitcoin, and we're saying that it has, let's call theoretical absolute scarcity or near theoretical absolute scarcity. It's got certainly properties better than gold, and it is prevalent, and it is available globally, and it is democratic. Does it have the ability to change human behavior on a mass scale? And that's my first question. And if so, where are we going with that? Into what direction would that take us, Bob?
Well, I think it takes us in a direction of, many people have said it, but it separates politics from money. And that, I think, is a very important thing. Historically, money has been controlled by governments, going back to Roman times and earlier. And that ability to manipulate things is a power that, in some ways, nobody wants, right? Right now, the U.S. is using its banking power to sanction other countries. Now, many people would say that's a useful tool and it's doing some good, but in other circumstances, this has been very harmful, right? In other circumstances, countries hyperinflate their currency or do crazy things to harm their enemies. Should money be a political tool? Historically, commerce and money and capitalism have been a democratizing force that basically put everybody on the same playing field. Ancient Venice wasn't powerful because of political reasons. It was powerful because they had awesome commerce, and it was a very democratic place where everybody could come and trade, right? And that ability to trade with your enemy, I mean, Bitcoin has been called the currency of enemies, right? The ability to trade with your enemy is powerful, right? It puts everybody on the same playing field. It doesn't care whether you're a socialist or a Marxist or a capitalist it doesn't matter. It doesn't care, right? And that, I think, is a peaceful, unifying force, to be completely honest.
It's also part of, obviously, the Enlightenment. The founding fathers of America were very inspired by Enlightenment ideas, and they said that. They said, trade with all nations. This was really important, and we've lost that somehow.
Yeah. If you can't trade with a nation because you have to trade in their currency, which they are, turning the knobs of, it makes there be less trade, right? Under the right circumstances, your trade falls apart. It also makes it so that countries can be less responsible with their debts and with their currency controls.
Now, let me ask you something about Satoshi. If you, as a physicist, and also understanding what Bitcoin mining actually does, converting energy into a transactable currency, do you think whoever Satoshi is, that they understood physics, and when you look at it as a physicist, do you think they had some understanding of physics?
I don't think so. Some of the early emails from Satoshi, he claimed that he modeled the production of Bitcoin as a certain number of gold mines that were equally distributed around the earth. And I think that's a pretty good model for how he was thinking. I don't think he was thinking about energy specifically. In the early days, you could mine Bitcoin with your computer, with your home computer. And no one was really considering the energy cost of doing so. It's only once mining started to become industrialized and we had special purpose ASICs that the energy part of the equation really became important. I mined a tiny bit of Bitcoin way back in the day, and I looked at it and I think I earned $3 worth of Bitcoin in a week, and I turned my computer into a very noisy space heater, and looked at my power bill and it was only $3. But okay, so this is a net loss, right? So why would I do this? Even in the early days, once we moved away from CPU mining, energy cost part of the equation started to become very important, right? Bitcoin's price has always stayed very close to the energy cost of mining it, just as the cost of gold has always remained close to the cost of mining it.
Right. So let me ask you this question. So in your view, would Bitcoin be a discovery or an invention? I think about this in terms of, let's say, E equals MC squared. That was, I would view as a discovery, because that was true before Einstein wrote that equation. That was true. I mean, he discovered that relationship. And in the case of Bitcoin, it seems that it existed before the protocol was launched, before in a lot of different ways. But what do you think of this, Bob?
I would say it's definitely an invention. There are elements of that existed. The mining function is hash cash, which Adam Back invented a number of years before Bitcoin came around. I remember hash cash back in the day because I ran my own email server, and it was intended originally as a means to stop email spam. We all get hit by spam. But so what Satoshi did is he glued together a number of human inventions to create Bitcoin. The blockchain is, from a computer science perspective, just a linked list. This is something that's been around for decades. The hash functions, right, have been human inventions, and there have been many forms of hash functions, and we have slowly iterated over the decades to produce better and better hash functions. Many of the early ones are now broken, and it's been said perhaps we've reached a point where we actually know how to construct hash functions correctly. And these are constructions; these are human inventions. Likewise, the cryptography involved, the digital signatures and things like that. We picked a particular form of mathematical function, an elliptic curve, right, And then we define a kind of operation on it so that we can add 2 points together and things like that. We constructed this. Humans constructed this, right? And then what Satoshi did is he took all those pieces and glued them together in a way, and then added rules, added nodes, added social rules around the issuance and things like that. Very much an invention.
So, one question we get asked all the time, and the most fear expressed from the community, maybe they're concerned trolls, who knows, but they always say, oh, quantum computers are coming and they're going to steal all your Bitcoin. You're a physicist. How real is this? Is this likely or not?
In my opinion, I don't think it's terribly likely. I think that quantum computing is unlikely to be really effective for cryptography. You can look at it and ask, like, how much energy is it going to cost to actually perform this quantum computation? And right now, we perform very, very small quantum computations, and we don't really have the capability to make them bigger. But as we make them bigger, they're going to be more and more expensive from an energy perspective. There are a lot of dissenting opinions within the quantum computing community itself from other physicists. And I'm not a quantum computing expert, so I'm reluctant to say this very strongly, but I think it's overhyped, if you will. People make speculative statements about their abilities to do quantum computing because they're trying to, make articles, and they're trying to get grant money, and they're trying to get their tenure and things like that. So there's a game theory around doing all of that, and we don't have a quantum computer. If a quantum computer does appear, right, I like to look at Bitcoin as the world's best canary in the coal mine for the existence of quantum computing, right? If somebody had a quantum computer, what better way to monetize that new invention than to either mine Bitcoin or try and break people's addresses and signatures? So it's I don't know. I find it fascinating from that perspective.
Well, okay. Then there's the other threat they always talk about is this EMP. I don't believe that. So unless you disagree with that, but I want to look at a bigger threat about our entire economy and society, because you mentioned that you worked on Higgs boson. And one thing I always do wonder is, like, these experiments that physicists are pulling in the mountains in Switzerland, you wonder, like, is there a remote chance that you might accidentally delete the universe?
No.
Okay, good.
Categorically, no.
Oh, I feel better.
So, fun story. Around the time the LHC started up, there was a lot of press that we were going to create a mini black hole and destroy the universe, right?
I remember that.
I wrote many papers about miniature black holes at the LHC, and I also wrote a paper about one of the doomsday scenarios somebody came up with, that the LHC magnets were going to form a superconducting Bose-nova, which was going to implode. This was all nonsense. And in fact, while I was at CERN, many of our staff members, myself included, had to produce a safety report. The theoretical physics department at CERN produced a safety review. Now, this safety review was unlike any safety you've ever seen, because the people claiming we were going to destroy the universe have zero evidence, right? Somebody wrote down some weird equation that we don't know if it's true. And if that equation is true, then something bad will happen. Okay, I can write down an infinite number of weird equations that we don't know are true, right? The purpose of doing these experiments is to figure out which of these things is true. So we can all go crawl into our hole and say we don't know which equations are true, and maybe one of them is really, really bad and remain Luddites forever. Or we can push the progress of science forward, do the experiments, make the measurements, and figure out what is true. You can look at it from another perspective and say, well, there are things going on in the universe at much, much higher energies than the ones we do in laboratories on Earth. And we've never seen catastrophic events like that some of these people were claiming. So, what has happened kind of sociologically is that in 1984, we discovered the top quark. 1994 was the year I graduated from high school. And after that, there was only one major thing to discover, and that was the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson was the completion of the standard model of particle physics, for which Weinberg won the Breakthrough Prize today. So we went looking for those things, but kind of starting around 1994, there was one thing we knew we had to find, and it was the Higgs boson. But there were, thousands of theoretical physicists. And they're all looking around saying, well, what do I do now? 1,000 people can't write a paper about the Higgs boson, right? There's just not that much to do. So they started coming up with other things to do. We invented extra dimensions. We invented micro black holes. We invented supersymmetry, leptoquarks, all kinds of crazy things. And I wrote papers about half of those things, because it was, exploration in every direction. The incentive within academia is to write papers, right? And in some ways, the best kind of paper you can write is one you can't prove or disprove, because you can write papers about that forever. And that's kind of what happened.
Is this why we see? Is this why we see so many altcoins?
Yeah, well, perhaps. Yeah. So we, as a physics community, wrote papers about a lot of crazy stuff that isn't real, right? We haven't found supersymmetry, we haven't found dark matter, and there's much more speculative things out there. Haven't found string theory, haven't found leptoquarks, haven't found micro black holes, Kaluza-Klein modes, all kinds of things. So people started worrying about these things, and some of them might have bad consequences, like micro black holes. But the fact of the matter is, we have not found them, and they probably don't exist. And even if they did, we wrote a whole paper for CERN showing how they weren't really a problem, weren't going to destroy the Earth. But
well, we at Orange Pill, believe it's kind of a Renaissance 2.0, and the first Renaissance was an age of discovery, and that's part of the age of discovery, right? A lot of your ideas of what might be there is turn out to be totally wrong, humiliatingly wrong, but you have to be willing to fall on your face and look like a jerk.
You got to try. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with having a wrong idea, right?
Yeah, there seems to be still this question, just from my cursory reading, as a generalist, but this idea of dark matter, and that somehow measurements of the universe are coming up inadequate, that there's something missing in the universe, and it's vaguely put under something called dark matter. So what is that still an open question, and is that still being studied? And where are we on that, in that part of the physics world?
So when I say that, like, the standard model is internally consistent, that the standard model does not include gravity. So however you want to view that, everything we do in particle accelerators, we fully understand, put it that way, right? All of the things that come out of our particle accelerators, we understand. But we don't see gravity in those experiments. Gravity is too weak. We also don't see dark matter. So there is not kind of a pinpoint for dark matter or gravity that tells us where to look, because they're much weaker forces. So yes, there are still problems to be solved there. But we're not going to solve them with particle accelerators, and we're not going to solve them by looking at smaller and smaller things.
And what does that portend? In other words, again, from my rudimentary reading of all this stuff, that apparently the dark matter dwarfs in size the what we call matter, and that it's most of our perception of the universe, of the multiverse, is in fact of dark matter. What does that tell us? What does that mean? What does that mean exactly?
Well, so these measurements come from looking at galaxies, right? So what we do is we, in our telescopes, we look at faraway galaxies, and the stars on the edge of the galaxy basically are moving too fast, right? They're orbiting, and using the orbit, you can figure out how much stuff is on the inside pulling in on the star that's orbiting around the galaxy. And it appears that there's more stuff in the center than we see, right? So we can basically add up all the stars in the center of the galaxy and get an estimate for the amount of matter there. And it's not enough. It's not enough by a factor of 3, roughly, to explain this. So this was discovered by Vera Rubin back in the day. And there are 2 ways to solve this. One is you can add more matter in the center and assume gravity is unchanged, right? The second way to do it is to modify gravity itself. The latter path has been less popular, but all of the dark matter things you hear in the media assume gravity is absolutely perfect and unmodified, and then I have to add new particles. We have no evidence that any other new particles exist. So in my opinion, it's actually a better path that the force law for gravity is actually modified. There's a branch of physics that goes into this. It's less popular than the dark matter hypothesis, but at the same time, we're also not discovering dark matter. It's possible we could produce dark matter in a particle accelerator. I wrote a number of papers about this, and we haven't found it, right? So perhaps we're looking in the wrong place.
Right, so it's a dark gravity, not dark matter.
It's a modification of how gravity works at long distances. Yeah, it could be.
Right. Okay. Well, I kind of agree with Einstein of the God doesn't play dice with the universe, because when I look at when I hear this stuff, it just seems like it's too much, doesn't make sense, and it's that's kind of scary.
Well, what's spooky? There's a spooky quantity. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's quite spooky, right? That the behavior change of matter changes depending on the observer of that matter. Okay, so that's kind of spooky, right? So things are happening differently if we're observing it or not. And so I want to tie that back to Bitcoin a little bit. Does Bitcoin exhibit some of these Heisenberg-esque uncertainty principles, where the Bitcoin protocol itself, we've established that how it kind of blends, it's a hybrid between the soft sciences and the hard sciences, and it has it's democratic, it's universal, it changes people's behavior. Is it possible that Bitcoin is, to some degree, certainly through the difficulty adjustment every 2 weeks, it seems to be know more about us than we know about ourselves to some degree? Is it observing us to a degree? From a physicist point of view, can someone make that statement and not be thrown out of a university? Bob.
I wouldn't say that it really has anything to do with physics, but in some sense it is observing us, right? Whenever you compute a block for Bitcoin, you are broadcasting a small piece of information about how you mined it, right? And what the difficulty adjustment algorithm does is it adds that all up over many people. And this, of course, is public information we broadcast to the world, but we are in the process revealing a little bit about how we're computing those blocks. And in particular, we reveal the time difference from the last block. And that's really the kind of only thing that goes into that calculation. And from that, we can compute the hash rate. And of course, my hash rate contributes to the global hash rate. And the way you know about my hash rate, even if I haven't told you, is through how fast I produce blocks.
Let's wrap up on where you think Bitcoin mining is going next. What happens next? Is this ASICs? Are we at the end of the chip speed? Like, what happens next? What might we see next?
Well, we're entering an era it's kind of unique. So chips for Bitcoin have followed the same path as chips for in your computer, right? We've gone for smaller and smaller feature sizes, smaller nanometers, and to make them faster and faster, because we basically hit a wall around 4 gigahertz. For 10 years now, you haven't been able to purchase a CPU over 4 gigahertz. For the decade prior to that, every year the clock speed went up and up and up and up until we hit 4 gigahertz. Now we are approaching a point where the thing that Bitcoin is most interested in is energy efficiency, right? We want to produce the most number of hashes for the least costs in energy. And it turns out making things smaller is not necessarily the best way to do that. As you go smaller, there are additional losses. Some due to quantum mechanics. There's a phenomenon called gate leakage, where the electricity going through a transistor, some of it actually leaks out through the sides, and this shows up as heat. So you can make it faster, but you make it less energy efficient. And so what's happening now, there have been a few articles. In fact, there was one about Bitmain just today, where the consumers of these devices are complaining that they're too expensive. And what we really want is energy efficiency. Miners today would prefer to buy an old S9 than a brand new S19, right? It's much cheaper. It's far more energy efficient. And so we're entering an era where the manufacturers of ASICs are going to prioritize producing kind of last year's model at high volumes for a lower price, because they are more energy efficient. Simultaneously, a lot of people around the world are looking for where is the cheapest source of electricity. And what's happening, it's very interesting, because Bitcoin mining can be turned on and turned off. It's an on-demand load, right? And you need that in a system. If you look at most energy markets, there are times and places where the price goes negative for electricity. And what that means is that it's being overproduced and there are no buyers for that energy. And that also means that the buffers in the system are insufficient. So all energy grids have some form of load which can be turned on and turned off, and there are means to regulate this. So the producer, the generator, will turn on at certain times depending upon the demand. There are markets around this. The fact that energy price goes negative is an indication that that market is insufficiently arbitraged, if you will. So Bitcoin is a new arbitrage tool that is essentially guaranteed demand. It's a guaranteed buyer that can be turned on and turned off. And so the game now is to figure out where is energy overproduced without a buyer. And Bitcoin's very mobile, right? I can move my Bitcoin miners around. I can turn them off when the price is too high. And Bitcoin's going to fill in and buy up all essentially the lowest price electricity, which is, it's good for a number of reasons. It's good for the profitability of generation facilities, and it's also good for the reliability of the grid, because if you produce too much and there are no consumers, right, this will create explosions and shorts within the grid and all kinds of other bad things. And so the energy companies regulate this in a lot of different ways, and this is a new tool.
The hash rate, which just made a new high of approximately 150 quintillion calculations per second, is that theoretically bound in some way, or can it keep going higher?
It can go arbitrarily high. It's going to go exactly as high as we think it's worth, right? The mining, investment going into mining on an energy basis or on a dollar basis will scale with the demand for buying Bitcoin.
One other quick technical question. So to solve for the hash, these miners are looking for the nonce. Is the nonce within a range, or can it theoretically keep going with more and more zeros, which is the header for the nonce? So that is part of the difficulty adjustment. Can that theoretically just keep going down that rabbit hole of, let's call it, quote, infinite zeros? Or is there a range per the protocol where that would not be the case? The range would be respected indefinitely.
There's no range. So you can view the difficulty algorithm as saying how many zeros in front of the number have to exist, right? So we need the first 17 digits to be zero, right? And when you do a difficulty adjustment, we say, okay, maybe it's 18 or 16 zeros, right? And that's what the difficulty adjustment does. That's not a precise statement, but approximately that's what it does. Now, you can keep adding zeros at the front, and more zeros at the front corresponds to higher difficulty, right? Less zeros is lower difficulty. So if the difficulty kept going up, we would keep adding zeros at the front. Now, you can reach a point where the number of zeros is all of them, right? So the entire block header is all zeros. Now, that is an amount of computation that is essentially larger than the computational ability of the entire universe. We're never going to get there. If we ever got close and we were worried about it, we could switch to a different hash function. So right now we use double SHA-256, has 256 bits. So in principle, there are 256 bits, all of which could be zero. If we were worried about that, we could just switch to another hash function like SHA-512. Now we have 512 bits. And each bit we add doubles the amount of calculation, or doubles the amount of energy required to get that next bit.
How do you view this? From a physicist perspective, here you have the price is going up, and as it goes up, more miners come in, hash rate goes up, and the nonce get smaller. So these two things seem to be going in opposite directions. In physics, do you find that in other phenomenon similar to that type of phenomenon?
I don't really understand the question. Let me correct one thing. The nonce is a number that goes into, it's an input to the hash function. So the hash function is 80 bytes of block header. It's got a timestamp. It refers to the previous block, and then is a nonce, right? So the nonce is just an arbitrary random number. And when I'm mining, what I'm doing is I'm taking that nonce and I'm trying every possibility. I try 1, I try 2, I try 3. Somebody else tries 17, 18, 19, etc. And we don't know which one is going to result in the output of the hash function being having a certain number of zeros. So I take this 80 bytes, I add 1 to the nonce, and I hash it, see how many zeros there are. Add 2 to the nonce, I hash it, see how many zeros there are.
But we're saying that it has a tendency to add more zeros as the system gets higher. And the system gets higher because the price goes higher. So I'm just saying that these two things are like going in opposite directions. But that's like more like we've talked about sociology and physics. To me, that's poetic. There's a certain poetic aspect to this design of the protocol. The protocol is aesthetically very pleasing, but that's another discussion, Stacy.
And finally, before we exit here, I want to say, when everybody looks at Bitcoin and they see whatever they want to see or they need to see, we've covered that in Nigeria, there's a huge use of Bitcoin because they don't have much access to the US controlled financial grid. For whatever reason, KYC and AML and all of that stuff. So in order to import cars from Japan, which is a huge apparent market, they send used cars over to Nigeria, they need to use Bitcoin because it makes what works for them. Obviously, many Westerners in America see it as a speculative asset. They want to buy a Lambo, right? So when you look at, and you've studied Bitcoin deeply and you understand it uniquely as a physicist, you can't escape that you are a physicist, and you could see and you understand mathematics and you see it. Like, is there anything that you see in Bitcoin that you don't really notice other people, like the rest of the community notice? Like, is there anything that you particularly find beautiful or fascinating or powerful about Bitcoin that you want to say in the last few moments here?
Well, I will say that I kind of really frame some of the things in Bitcoin in terms of the computation the universe can do. If you ask, is my Bitcoin secure? Can anybody steal them? This really comes down to how much computation can somebody do, both for mining as well as for digital signature. And you have to compare to kind of a benchmark of how much computation could anybody possibly do in the whole universe. And you could say crazy things like, let's say I had the whole sun's worth of energy or the whole galaxy's worth of energy. How much computation could I do? Could I steal your Bitcoin? And the answer is no. So that's kind of the security level involved here. And if you look at it through that kind of lens, I think it's a bit fascinating.
That's a very good point. If you had all the universe available, the energy, you still couldn't, it's still secure. I mean, that's really amazing. That's an amazing point.
Yeah, the total amount of computation in the universe, right, is another metric. And that's not even enough to break Bitcoin.
Wow. Well, that makes me feel better about all the Stacys and the parallel dimensions apparently not being there after all my years of thinking they were there.
No, I thought that they had stolen your coins.
Well, in a parallel universe, maybe somebody actually broke the signature algorithm or broke the hash function. That's most likely. It's unlikely somebody got an entire galaxy worth of energy together.
Well, okay. Thank you so much for being on Orange Pill, because this is really mind-blowing. We like to blow minds here. So thank you for helping to blow some minds out there.
Yeah, Bob, thanks.
Thank you very much, guys.
So much to unpack there. Bob is a jewel in the Bitcoin space, and he brings to the conversation so much lucidity, which you don't get. If you're on crypto Twitter, for example, it's 99% trolling. But when you have a few people like that are just always consistently talking about stuff that is useful, it's so valuable.
Well, as you're constructing a new reality, it's very important, I feel, to me anyway, is that you have a lot of different perspectives. So if this guy is a physicist and a mathematician, like he could see the world in different units of like what we're actually seeing and experiencing versus, say, a doctor or like Nozomi Hayes, who's a psychologist. So like if you have those sort of inputs into your understanding of this world that you're building and fabricating out of the ingredients of society and the economy and monetary systems, then like it helps to think of possibilities. It's an age of exploration, Renaissance 2.0. It's another age of exploration. So we're exploring the boundaries of our possibility in this day and age. And perhaps a post-nation state period, there's most of history was not in a nation state sort of experience. It's been more like smaller communities. And maybe we're going back to that. Maybe we're not. Maybe there's going to be like the fight to have one world government, as some people fear. Like, who knows?
There is always the frontier. And the problem in history has been that people have decided that to close the frontier and that these are the rules, this is the dogma, this is how you must live, and that's the end of the story. And if you don't believe it, then go to prison. And but the frontier never closes. The frontier is infinite. The human imagination, human consciousness is infinite. And, this is not to be frightened. Should not be fearful of the infinite possibilities of the human experience, and ultimately the infinitely insignificance of the human experience. I mean, we're here just for one reason, and that is to have fun. and then we're gone, and that's it. But if you spent the whole time without having any fun, you missed life.
Well, with that, I want to follow up more on this notion of energy and input into Bitcoin mining, because we'll turn to our sponsor again, Abe Cambridge of the Sun Exchange, because he made this video based on some feedback that, he checks out the Telegram group, which is Telegram Orange Pill, and looks at the comments on our YouTube and stuff like that. And so he looked at this notion of excessive energy cost to mining Bitcoin, and he compares it to the cost of mining gold, for example.
So there are many people who clearly haven't taken their orange pills yet and are still greatly concerned around the energy consumption of the Bitcoin mining network. So to those people, just consider for a moment that Carl Benz, the inventor of the car, went to work on horseback, and Thomas Edison invented the light bulb using an oil lamp. Now, the point is, to make our quantum singularity omelette, we're going to have to break some three-dimensional eggs. And here is 3 eggs that I want to break immediately. Egg number 1, you've got to look at what Bitcoin is replacing as a store of value, and that is physical gold. Now, mining gold uses approximately 82 terawatt hours of electricity a year to get our gold out the ground. The Bitcoin mining network uses 67 terawatt hours of electricity a year to mine. So that means it's 20% less efficient to mine gold as a store of value than Bitcoin. And that's before you've even transported your physical gold around the world and stored securely, whilst it obviously costs nothing to store and transmit Bitcoin. Egg number 2, Bitcoin mining is a race for efficiency. Whoever can mine Bitcoin using the least amount of energy or using the cheapest form of energy is going to win. Now, wind and solar are now the cheapest forms of energy on Earth, which is why China, where a lot of Bitcoin is mined, is now 10% wind and solar powered, and this is only increasing. Now, if the energy you're using to create your Bitcoin is from a renewable source, where the only environmental impact was what took to create that generator, but has no impact ongoing for decades, it doesn't matter if you're using a lot of energy to mine Bitcoin. And the third egg to break, and this one is a biggie, it's what you do with your Bitcoin that matters. Now, if you were to just hodl onto theoretical value forever and take it to your grave, then yes, that was a tremendous waste of energy. But put your Bitcoin to work and magic can really happen. Now, at the moment, it takes 100 megawatt hours of electricity to mine 1 Bitcoin. But 1 Bitcoin can currently finance 10 kilowatts of solar power capacity. Now, that 10 kilowatts of solar power capacity will produce 300 megawatts of electricity over its lifespan. So you effectively tripled the amount of energy it took to create the Bitcoin in positive energy balance. Now, here's where the magic happens. That Bitcoin that you use to finance that solar power still exists. It can still circulate and do additional work. You're creating a positive energy feedback loop. That means even after you've spent your Bitcoin on financing a solar power plant, which in itself produces yield that you can earn Bitcoin from through a platform like Sun Exchange, you can then use that income to finance more solar power capacity. Now, if you were to finance the solar powering of the Bitcoin mining network, which in itself produces a positive energy balance, then you truly have created the energy money singularity to create a silicon-based economy of abundance. And we're going to need such an energy flippening to happen if the human race is going to become a Kardashev Type 1 civilization.
Wow, yeah, man, Abe, it's like, it's such a good video. So let me get this right. The cost of mining Bitcoin versus traditional energy is 20% cheaper, but then when you recycle that into remining, the cost drops exponentially again, something along those lines. It becomes this virtuous machine that's piping into, as we say with Bob there, you know, we had the discussion about what qualifies as infinite energy. Okay, I understand that, but nearly infinite energy, you know, from where we are now, certainly the oil and gas industry is very limited, but once you tap into this new energy paradigm, you are opening up this positive feedback, this virtuous feedback loop, which seems really to match what would be a human capacity for transcendentalism and transcendence, right? Then this is one of the things that comes up during any Renaissance, is the transcendence of the situation at hand to a different situation, a quantum leap into a new situation. And this energy equation, gold versus Bitcoin, and what's happening with the Sun Exchange and everything going on down there, it seems like Abe Cambridge is like the Medici of this Renaissance.
Yeah, as you know, actually, we're going to have him on. I want him to talk to Tyson Slocum of Public Citizens Energy Program, because I want to talk about this notion of solar punk. I don't know if you've heard of this, but this solar punk movement has been around since 2014, but it's starting to gain strength, and it's building this community of resilience, of anti-fragility, of peer-to-peer sort of decentralized energy systems, money systems, stuff like that. And that's a really cool name, a solar punk, right?
Yeah, I'm digging it, man. I'm going solar punk. I'm there. I'm j'y suis.
And so, you know, with that notion of E equals MC squared, it's this interesting concept of, you know, of converting it back and forth is essentially what he's saying. Is you take the energy, it takes this many kilowatts or megawatts to create one Bitcoin. You take that Bitcoin and you build more solar power plants and to mine more Bitcoin. And it's like forever. It's like you convert it to energy, back to matter, back to energy, and back to matter.
Right. There is a river runs through it all. There is a river of infinite possibility and infinite energy that running through the multiverse. And we can stick our finger in there and feel it. And we've been doing that for 1 million years. That's what human experience has been. We're the only species that has poked the face of God and said, "What up, dude?" And we've been both satisfied. We've gotten the both end of the tail here. We've gotten the tragic side of that and the euphoric side of that. But we're not going to stop poking God, because God's lonely. He needs to poke. God's like the ultimate Facebook poke me.
I poked Satan. I want to tell you this because this reminds me of when I was 5 years old and we moved from New York City to Connecticut. And, so from a big city to countryside. And there was a stone wall right in front of our new house in the countryside. And I saw a snake go into the crevice. And I didn't know it was a snake. I didn't know what a snake was. I had lived in Queens. I didn't know. I had only seen concrete sidewalks. And I reached into the hole and I grabbed the snake. And it bit me. And I was like, that sucks. And I just, walked out into the woods.
This is like the whole Adam and Eve story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Getting back to the beginning. Adam and Eve went from atomization to leave, opt out. Don't stick your hand in the snake. Don't do what Eve did in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
Didn't she tempt the snake?
Well, luckily, it appears that it was just a garter snake, but there were copperheads and rattlesnakes in that area. So I don't know what kind of snake it is, but I could see the hole. I could see myself sticking my hand in there.
Right. If I was there, I would probably be saying, hey, you might want to think twice before sticking your hand in that snake hole, and that wouldn't have stopped you, though.
No, that's the story of my life. That's how I learned. That's my way of learning. I'm a really bad... Actually, this brings me to this next point before we go, because I have to fail in order to learn. That's the only way I do, because I'm a really bad learner sitting in a class listening to a professor. I see people who can do that, and I envy that, but I can't do that. So I do want to try not only this Zoom call where we all buy some solar panels, if they're available on the Sun Exchange. They sell out in 30 minutes. So I want to do that, but I also want to do some live streaming. So if you're, I want to try me and Max just doing a microdose of orange pill instead of this 1.5 hour episode. I just want to do a 20, 30 minute episode, but using my live streaming software. and it could totally fail. It might just like blow up, and I can't figure out how to do it, and it's just gonna like freeze after 3 minutes. But just so you know, like this is one of the experiments, a microdose of orange pill I want to try live with live streaming software.
As long as I don't have to shave, I'm down.
Well, I think that's a good point, that because look,
You're out.
my margarita's all gone.
How was it, by the way? Was it good cocktail the mixing of that cocktail?
Well, Cointreau is orange,
Right.
flavored, liqueur.
Okay, well, that one uses Grand Marnier, but we'll let that
Grand
slide.
Marnier is also orange, so you could use either of them for a margarita, but Cointreau is, of course, the only official way accepted by a genuine Mexican.
Right. So I take that as a thumbs up.
I take it as a thumbs up.
I think, yeah. Are we signing off?
We are signing
We're going to
off.
sign off. Yeah, that's cool.
We're going to go drop some more orange pills. Thank you for joining us.
Bye now. See ya.